Hi, my name is Fanny Garcia and I'm an artist in the Bay Area, and today I'm going to be teaching you the cyanotype method through self-help graphics and art and family workshop. Here's my introduction. My name is Fanny Garcia. I'm an artist in the Bay Area and my background is in photography, printmaking, and cyanotypes. I was in the military. I joined when I was 19. I joined the Army, and these are just a few photos of my time in service. I went to school to study photography, but I took upon printmaking, specifically screen printing, and I took my own photographs that I took while I was in the Army and converted them into different types of imagery using screen printing. And this is an image here of people that were in my unit having lunch on this truck. I also started incorporating things that we would eat. For example, MREs were meals that we would eat out in the field, and everything was pre-packaged, and so I did a screen print of that. I also started playing with words and text over photographs, and this is also a photograph that I took, and it's a soldier putting food onto a plate of another soldier, and then I have this text that's been written on top, and this text is related to an Army cadence that we would often say when we would be running. So aside from screen printing, I also am a photographer. I specifically work with film analog cameras, and this is my most recent series of self-portraits where I did a sort of a continuous of different poses in one room. And now I'm going to be segueing, and I'm going to be showing you my own examples of cyanotypes, and I'm going to be introducing you to different materials that you're going to need and that you could use to create designs. And just wanted to start off with a brief history. This method is really old. It was invented in 1842 by this scientist named John Herschel, and he discovered that ferric ammonium citrate and ferrocyanide, by mixing these two liquids, that it would form a light sensitive sensitizer that you can paint on anything, and I'll go into that as I move along. And like I said, we're working with light sensitive material. And cyanotypes, I like to describe them as a sunburn. If you've ever gone to the beach and you forgot to put sunblock and you've been under the sun, then the part that is covering your body leaves, you have the marking because that's the part that the sun didn't touch. And so cyanotypes work in a similar way, where as I'm going to be demonstrating to you, wherever you're blocking the sun is going to leave a marking. And so these are just examples that I found on the internet of people creating designs, art designs on their bodies. Well, the one on the right. And cyanotypes are very popular. They're all over Instagram, and I just wanted to go over or just show you a few hashtags that people or artists like to put under their work. And cyanotypes are known for sun photography, cyanotype process. It's considered an alternative process. You might be familiar with blueprint, which is more common, and you probably didn't even know it was a cyanotype, but there's World Cyanotype Day, and I wanted to introduce, oh, here's an example of a blueprint. So architects would use cyanotypes, but they would refer to them as blueprints to create drawings of homes. But I wanted to introduce to you Anna Atkins, who basically, she was the first person who used this method to create these, and I have some examples to show you, but she was the first woman to use objects to create impressions. And she was an English botanist, and instead of illustrating every single plant, she was really good friends with John Herschel, and so he showed her the method, and then she took it upon herself to create these impressions of British algae. And so there's a huge collection of her work. One specifically, there's a large collection of her images in New York City. And this is an example of ferns. And this is another example of another fern. And this is a shot from her book. This is another study of British algae. And then, so this is a more modern take. This is work by John McFarlane. And this artist is sort of taking the process into a different level. So he's layering these 3 pieces of paper to create sort of a collage and to create a single impression using all of the images. So this is more contemporary work. This is a shot from his studio, and this is just an example of how an artist can start playing with different shapes and making the paper into objects and folding them and cutting them. This is another example by a collaboration of 2 different artists, and here these 2 artists are working together to create one single image. And here's another example. This artist here is using cutouts. So on the right hand side, we're seeing these cutouts of this really dark paper and creating mountains. And then this artist is making impressions and then adding watercolor and ink to her prints. So cyanotypes will always be blue and white, just because of the chemical reaction that it causes. But just to show you an example of how this artist takes a step beyond that and is adding her own color after she's made her impressions. This artist is using different objects. You can use negatives, like film negatives, to create images, but today we're going to be focusing on objects. And here's another digital negative collage. And then one more. This is an example of my own work. So here I've used a drawing on transparency paper, and it's a drawing of a bird from El Salvador, which is where my family's from. These are objects that I used. They're also objects from El Salvador, and I'll have more examples to show you how this is done. This is actually a hammock, and so I just placed the hammock on top of this paper, and it created this ghostly appearance. And then this is also one of my photographs. It's actually a film negative that I used to create this image. So I like to think about cyanotypes as painting with light. Photography is painting with light because we wouldn't be able to see or make photographs without any light. So cyanotypes work in a similar way. So now I'm going to be going over materials. And I'm going to switch over to this camera here. So I'm going to be using paper today, and this is watercolor paper. Since we're going to be using liquid water, I find that watercolor paper is absorbent and it just works well with liquid. And I like to use, so these are the bottles that I use. It's through this company called Jacquard, and it comes in a set. It comes in part A here, and then it comes in part B. And in here, they come with powder inside in these dark bottles, because the manufacturer will ask well, it's in the instructions here, but you do have to fill up these bottles with water 24 hours prior to starting your printmaking process. And so I've already prepped these, and there's liquid in here, and once you fill them with water, you shake them, and then you just leave them undisturbed for 24 hours, and then they should be ready to go the next day. So the next material list, the next item on the materials list is a brush. This is a sponge brush. You can use any type of brush that you would like, but I find that these are really easy to absorb liquid and brush onto the paper. The next thing you want is a container to hold your liquid. And this is a recycled container that I just grabbed, and it seems to work for me, but it could be anything. These chemicals are non-toxic, so you can put them in anything. I have a designated measuring spoon, and this is a half tablespoon because you do want to work with small increments when you're pouring out the liquid. And then the most important thing that you want is gloves, and also to make sure that you're wearing something that you don't want to ruin, because the synthesizer here, once it comes out, it could stain your clothing and you might not be able to wash it off. But in the case that does happen, if it goes onto your skin, you can wash it or try to rinse it for 15 minutes. That's the recommendation on the manufacturer label. And then the next thing you want, so now you have your paper and you have your brush. The next thing that you want is to gather objects that you might want to make impressions of. Organic objects like foliage make really interesting shapes because it's just so natural. I also have these rocks. So I have a collection of rocks here that I can make impressions with, rocks and crystals. I also have this like cat. It's like a little sculpture of a cat, and I actually have an example of that to show you what that looks like afterwards. So here's an example that I made using this cat here, and the way this works is once we've painted on the solution onto the paper and waited the time period, then you would just put the cat on top of the paper here. So I'm going to get started so I can show you that process. The last thing that you need to get started is to have some sort of table covering, because we're going to be working with this chemical. I have a cardboard box that I use, so I'm going to pull that out and I'm going to put it here. And this is all blue because this is like where the synthesizer has dried. So I'm going to start by putting on my gloves. And then I'm going to take my cup, and you only want to pour out a little at a time. So the way this works is you mix these chemicals in equal parts. So this is a half a tablespoon, so I'm just going to pour 1/2 tablespoon of that, and that's part A. So part A is potassium ferrocyanide, and then I want to pour part B. So once that's in your cup, this, if you leave it out, it'll be stable for about 2 to 4 hours. So I want to go ahead and mix. You could mix it with the smaller brush or like a stir stick if you want. But once I have that mixed, then I want to bring my paper in. And you just start coating the paper. So the synthesizer is this really bright yellow color, and you want to work in subdued light. So I do have the blinds closed in my kitchen. It is okay to work under house lights, so if there are lamps or the ceiling lights are on in your home or your studio, that is perfectly okay. You just don't want direct sun hitting this. So after this is all coated, you want to designate a dark room. So I've emptied out the bottom of my kitchen sink. So if you have that available to you, you do have to find a dark room, or a dark cupboard will work. And so I'm going to go ahead and put this underneath the sink so that it has time to dry. And the dry time for this could be 30 minutes to an hour. So I'm going to go ahead and put this under the sink, and I'll be right back. So I'm going to do one more, just in case you need to see this again. So this synthesizer can be painted on anything. I'm just using paper today because it's the easiest thing to acquire. But you could paint this on a white shirt, for example. It doesn't have to be white, but white makes a good contrast. You could paint the synthesizer on wood, basically anything that will absorb liquid. And you just want to make sure that you glide the brush all over the paper, just making sure you're covering the white areas, maybe you missed a spot. So I would just go over horizontal strokes and vertical strokes just to make sure that you're covering all the areas. All right, so it did warp a little bit, and that's okay. We are working with watercolor paper. I have seen some paper that isn't watercolor warp really, really bad, and then in the end, the paper kind of stays that way. So watercolor is a good option. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and put this in the sink, and I'll be right back. Okay, now that I've coated my paper, I can move my box out of the way. If you have a table covering, you could leave that on. So while the paper is waiting, I have one that's already dry. So once it dries, it could have some discoloration here, maybe because the liquid, there was more liquid on this side, but that doesn't matter because we're going to be placing objects, and the end result is always a mystery. You never know what it's going to look like. But I have, let's see, so I have an arrangement of flowers, and I am just going to play around with my objects and find a good composition. So I also have these these things that I found. So I went on a walk and I found all these objects, and so I thought it would be interesting to include these objects. So I think I like this arrangement. So what I'm going to do, I like to have a vehicle. You can take this paper and carry it out with you. We're gonna have to go outside in the sun. So once we're out in the sun, this paper will begin to, it'll start exposing. And so your clock is running at that time. And I'm in sunny California, so the sun is pretty bright. So I'm going to say this is only going to take me 3 minutes, and I have an example of what a time sheet looks like. I just have to find it. Let's see. Okay, so this is a test that I did, and just to give you a sense of what kind of time we're working with on a bright sunny day, this here is 1 minute exposure, and here is 2 minutes, and here is 3, 4, and then it just sort of disappears. So you can work in different shades of blue, and you could just find the shade that you want. Doing a test isn't necessary, but it's nice to see what kind of shades of blue you'll get the longer you let the print expose. So I'm working with the same lighting conditions, so I'm just going to go ahead and leave it outside for 3 minutes or even 4 minutes just to get that really nice deep blue. So I'll just say I'm going to go with 4 minutes today. So back again to my composition here with things that I found on a walk. Like I said, I like to have a vehicle to carry this outside. So any book will work. I like using big books. So I'm just gonna go ahead and tuck this. I have this big giant Frida book. So you'll see Frida here in a second. All right, so I'm gonna arrange my work again because it got disassembled. Okay, let's see here. Okay, so I like this arrangement, and now I'm going to walk outside and place it somewhere in the sun. Okay, so here I am outside and I've set my timer for 4 minutes. So one of the things I'm noticing is the shadow that's happening underneath the objects. And we're looking for a bronze color. So as time passes, that yellow greenish is going to get darker, and then it's going to turn into a bronze color. So that's what we want to shoot for. Hi, I'm back. I just got to set up my camera again. Okay, so now that I've made my exposure, this was a 4-minute exposure, I can take my objects off. And this is what it looks like after you've made a proper exposure. You can see the outlines of your objects, and now I'm going to put on my gloves again. Let me go grab my gloves. Since we're going to be putting this into water, I want my gloves on. So we do need a bath of cool water. You can use your sink, you can use your bathtub, you can use buckets. So I have this water here, and I'm just going to dump it in. And manufacturer says to wash this for about 5 minutes, so I'm going to leave this in here for about 5 minutes. And if you can see, not sure if you can see, but the yellow, the chemical that we painted on, is starting to come off the areas that were blocked off from the light. So if you have a tray sort of similar, I would just tilt it back and forth so that the water is running over the print here. If you've ever worked with black and white photography, it's very similar. And So the next steps after this is done, then you want to hang it, you want to dry, put it out to dry. And I have a clothing line outside my apartment with clothing pins, and I just pin it to the line and hang it dry. But you don't have to do that. You can use a cardboard box just to lay your paper down. You can use stacks, maybe like 2 layers of paper towels so that it soaks up the water. Sometimes if I take this out, sometimes we'll have yellow staining in the white areas. If you do see that happening to your print, I would leave it in the water for a longer period of time, or just go ahead and rinse it with clean water. If you're doing it in the sink, you can dump the water, let the water drain, and then fill the sink back up with water until it runs clear. So I'm at 3 minutes, and I want to wait 2 more minutes so that that is a 5-minute mark. So objects can be, doesn't have to be flowers. It could be an arrangement of kitchen utensils. It could be, you could play around with objects like plastic that are more see-through and see what kind of designs you can achieve using that. I've seen people use bottles, glass bottles, and those always make interesting designs because you have a lot of light coming through the bottles. But going back to Anna Atkins, I just wanted to give you an example of something simple. And Anna Atkins would make these arrangements with British algae to create these photographic looking impressions without having to illustrate. You get a lot of detail just by laying objects onto the paper. So 1 more minute, and then I'll be at my 5-minute mark. If you do have liquid left over, I'd recommend using it. If not, if you don't have any paper or don't have anything else to paint it on, then I would just throw it down the sink. Just make sure that you're wearing gloves when you're handling the solution. So I'm at 5 minutes. So I'm going to take this out and I'm going to let it drip some water here. And then I'm going outside to hang it out to dry. So once it dries, it will become a deeper blue. So this is not the blue that is going to, this is not the final blue that it's going to look like. So it's going to get a little bit deeper than that. So I'm going to go outside and hang it to dry. Okay, now I can take my gloves off and I'll show you where I have it hanging outside. All right, well, that concludes the demonstration for today's cyanotype workshop.
So where again can you get the cyanotype, the sensitizer?
So the easiest website would be Amazon. Amazon carries the Jacquard Cyanotype Part A, Part B. It comes like in it's just these two bottles. You can also look at different art supply, like your local art supply store might have some. They might carry different versions. You don't have the way I showed you. We did it from scratch, so I coated the paper. You can buy pre-coated paper so that you don't have to mess with the chemicals, but you have way more control and way more artistic, um, creative decisions to paint the paper on a different, or not paint the paper, but paint the liquid onto a different surface other than paper.
Okay. And so any recommendations? Like I know you mentioned glass, like using a glass or using like parts of nature, but any other things have you tried?
So I've used my own negatives. So I work with a lot of analog and black and white photography. You can actually use, even though they're small, you can actually use film negatives to create exposures. And it'll look like your picture, but it'll be blue and white. So that's one way to, if you want to see sort of a more of a photograph kind of look, there are, and we can include the links in the video, there is a website that Jacquard has made it super easy for everybody to basically create their own phone pictures into digital negatives. You do need a printer at home, and you do need to buy transparency paper specifically for your printer so that you can print out your picture onto that type of material and then use that to create images instead of creating shapes with objects.
Okay. Um, and have you ever tried fabric?
Yes, so one of the examples I showed you in my presentation is I coated, so this is cotton. I coated both sides, and it's 12 by 12, and it's basically a napkin that I just bought off Amazon. And I I coated I coated both sides. So what I did was I coated one side and I had to let that dry. And because it's fabric, it took a little longer than paper. So I would wait until it's completely dry if you're using fabric. If you don't coat the backside, then you don't get the blue on the backside. It won't go through. I did a test, and I knew I wanted to have both sides, and so it was double the work. So I coated the first side, let that dry. I coated the back side, let that dry. Then I made my first exposure on one side, and I didn't develop it in water. I flipped it around and made a second exposure so I would have the same image when I flipped it. And then I put it in the water. And fabric, I noticed that it took a little bit a longer wash because it's thicker and different material. I was getting some yellow stains in the white, and that just means there's some chemical residue in those areas, and so you just want to keep washing it until that's all out.
So who would you recommend this for? Like what ages can start with this project?
Basically, if your little ones, if your little ones can fiddle around with objects, it could start from like 3 or 4. It's for all ages. The chemicals are non-toxic. They do recommend, this manufacturer recommends using gloves. So, if you're working with children, maybe you want to assist them with the developing process of coding the pages or whatever material you choose. And also when putting it into the bath, I would just have them place the objects so that they're not touching the chemicals. And anyone could do it. I mean, there's a lot of contemporary artists that are using this medium. It's all over social media. It's all over Instagram, and there's a lot of different techniques that people are using. I'm just showing you the really basic techniques that will give anybody an entryway to start making designs.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a very cool intersection of science and art.
Mm-hmm.
Like it could be like a beginning STEM kind of project to go and gather natural art pieces or natural well art, they are art pieces, you know, flowers and leaves and things like that. So that I think is a good way of connecting nature to art. Um, and I just want to say before we leave, thank you, Fanny, for joining us at Self Help Graphics for our family workshop this month.
Yes, I wanted to give a shout out to Self Help Graphics for giving me this opportunity to teach this wonderful ancient, I mean, it's not that ancient, well, it is in our lifetime, 19th century technique that has lived, and survived with artists through all those years. So I really hope that people can get their hands on some of these materials so that they could start creating their own projects and ideas and compositions.
Yeah, thank you for giving us that way.
Great. Thank you so much.